raw mechanics of how I found all the information that I have found is I just randomly throw things around in my head. Just intuitively, I'll get some kind of an impulse to think about whatever, and I just do. And then I try to fit that logically together with something else. Kind of like if I were to have a whole bunch of puzzle pieces all strewn out, and then I just take any random two and I try to fit them together. And if I get a couple of them to fit them together, I set those aside and I see if I can fit those into any of the other compounds that I've found so far. And I build until I find the largest integrated mass that I can. So that was how I mechanically built it. But the technical way of structuring the theory is that you have a central axiom, which, like I said, is arbitrary. It's just going to be arbitrary. You can assert whatever you want. You can assert nothing. You can assert anything. You can assert everything. You can assert whatever you want. And then from that assertion, then you have to draw one of those three respective logical conclusions from that, given that as a premise. And since those are absolutes, you can derive any relativity from an absolute because you can just simply relate it back to itself. Every absolute has a self-relation. You can then use that self-relation to build a symbol out of the absolute, which is what you then say is the image of the axiom, the image of the thing that you're asserting, the outline of it. And you build that, and then you say, just through defining it, and that definition is the outline of the central axiom that you're making. So to give a clearer picture, it's sort of like if you were to assert nothing, what is the only logical conclusion that you can draw from nothing? Well, the only logical conclusion that you can draw from nothing is nothing. In other words, you cannot draw a conclusion. So when I say nothing, I mean nothing. I don't mean like the iteration of nothing or the conclusion of nothing or even the image of nothing, but not anything at all, so that you cannot draw a conclusion. So the conclusion is that you cannot draw a conclusion. And that paradox is the same paradox as nothing related to itself. It has the same structure as the self-relation of nothing. So, that will give you an idea of like how to actually apply the central axiom of any given theory. That's how you find it, is you pick whatever arbitrary thing that you want. And I just, for example, used nothing. And then you derive from that its self-relation, its relation to itself, because that's the image, that's the relativistic image that you can render inside your theory, so that your theory then has a definition, and that definition is then an image, and it's interchangeable with the actual thing that it's referring to, the central axiom itself. The definition of that axiom is the image that you use to refer back to the axiom. And you're saying that the axiom is so self-evident that you don't have to provide any justification for it. You just take it as given. And the reader should do the same. And if they can't, then they would have to move on to some other theory. If they can't accept the central axiom of that theory, then they won't be able to accept anything thereafter because everything revolves around that central axiom. So I gave the example of nothing because it's an absolute and all absolutes have self-relations. But I think that not only do they have a self-relation, but they have a self-relation that's so generalized that it could apply to everything. So you could also assert everything, and you could assert everything as a totality. So the self-relation there is the opposite of the self-relation of nothing, such that the self-relation of everything is infinitely self-inclusive. And that's also a paradox because you've got the set of all sets. Does the set of all sets include itself? It does iteratively, but then you still have to answer that question about when does it end? When is the final iteration? The final iteration is when you take the measurement. So that it really then depends on the measurer rather than the thing being measured in and of itself. And the self-relation there of infinite self-inclusion would be, if you're going to try to define it, it would be the opposite of nothing, and nothing had, what did it have? Because you can't draw any conclusion. So then in this case, you would be forced to draw every conclusion, which is the opposite of nothing, right? Because if you're presented with nothing, then you can't draw any conclusion. So then if you're presented with everything, then you have to draw every conclusion. So any possible conclusion that you could ever think of drawing must be given. So basically what that does is it sets you up with the same kind of a platform, because it says that everything is just inherently an arbitration anyway, because it's one out of an infinitude of other possibilities, all of which are necessary. So then they're all equally valid, but they're also all equally interchangeable as well, because they're all part of one totality. So to assert that totality is then to assert everything, very much like Bertrand Russell and Whitehead did in their Principia book, where they literally asserted every single thing in their theory, which makes the theory a smattering of simple finger painting, which makes my skin crawl. But anyway, so the assertion of everything would then necessitate that we draw every possible conclusion from that. And so we end up with an arbitration space, which would be identical to the zeroth dimension. Specifically, it's identical to the external surface area on top of, or the topology of, the zeroth dimension. But the platform of nothing is the absolute center of that, so that you can actually have both of these in larger theory if you wanted to, in which case you're asserting both nothing and everything, and you're asserting that those are separated. Or you could even, I suppose, derive that from the simple paradox of them coexisting in the same place, the impossibility thereof. And you could say then that there's a law of displacement, and you could, derive things from there. But the one that you choose is, like I said, arbitrary. You can choose whichever one you want. If you choose to assert anything, in other words, indiscernibility itself, then what you're doing is asserting that you can and must draw any conclusion, but it's limited then to only a single specific conclusion. So it's similar to asserting everything, except you're asserting anything in this case, so it's much more limited, and it's finite, and it's specific to some arbitrary fundamental, like time or space or mind or consciousness or energy or whatever you want. And you can then turn everything into an arrangement of that. And you can say, that is the monad, that's the substratum from which everything is constituted. And then you just arrange the monad structure, whatever you have asserted there, the specific fundamental that you've asserted, and you displace that from itself in various arrangements so that it doesn't have a singularity anymore, it's a multiplicity of those. And that's how you get the globally static but locally fluctuating state of indiscernibility that is asserting anything. So this theory, having asserted a specific assertion, has then fallen into the category of asserting anything, just like pretty much every theory that we're going to have will do, except for two of them. There will be two theories, one of which asserts nothing, the other of which asserts everything. And those two theories are archetypal, and those aren't really part of any sort of, deus ex machina specificity or anything like that. They're just there as limits of relativity that describe its origin and its terminus as a field, so that the framework or context or reference frame which surrounds and defines everything inside of it, which would be the theory, so that if you were to choose one of those, it would be defined by its opposite. So if I assert nothing, that's the framework of asserting nothing is to have asserted everything. So the framework, when we assert nothing, is larger than that assertion, and it's defining that assertion so that we're not smuggling anything in. What we're doing is we're distinguishing and using the reference frame to measure the referent. We're using the limits of the contextual evaluative tool that we're using, the lens, in order to define what the lens is actually focusing on, so that there's a distinction between the two. If I assert everything, that's going to be defined by nothing, so that the framework outside of everything is nothing. So that when I'm talking about everything, I'm talking about it as measured as the negation of nothing, that it is not nothing. And likewise, vice versa, if you assert nothing, then the framework, the contextual definition of having asserted nothing is to assert everything, so that the assertion of nothing is then being defined by the assertion of everything. The reason that that's necessary is because when you assert nothing, then you might be tempted to say, I don't know how to proceed from that point, because if I've asserted nothing, then I've also asserted a lack of logic in order to proceed with any kind of a logical analysis. So then I can't really have performed any assertion to begin with, so then I'm stuck in this weird paradox of nothing having encapsulated everything, at which point which one wins, and then we assert nothing, and so then we have no assertion. So the only way that we can actually assert nothing is if we have a reference frame of having already asserted everything, and from that derive a single specificity of one of those assertions, namely the assertion of nothing. So that is how we build those reference frames in order to define the referent that's inside of them. We're not smuggling anything. We are deriving the contextual value of the definition of the referent from the reference frame. And as long as we define that reference frame specifically enough that we can distinguish it from any other reference frame, then we're golden. We can go ahead and do that. Now, of course, then we run into the next justification problem, which is how do you justify having made that? And of course, that's beyond the limit of relativity, because you can only have two referents inside of a logical system and still use logical validity to validate it. It exists, logic itself and discernibility and relativity all exist as two referent systems, so that they're all in a linear single dimension, one dimension. With that being said, you can't have a justification for that reference frame, because the limit of relativity makes it so that you can't have a third independent referent. You can only have the two. You can have the referent itself being the first referent, and then the reference frame for that referent being the second independent referent in the two reference system of discernibility itself. So in other words, if you were to try to justify it, you'd have to go outside of logic to do it. And that's how you know it's a central axiom. But that central axiom, like I said, it isn't in a vacuum. It doesn't exist in a vacuum. You have to assert something within a framework so that you make, essentially, you make two assertions, not to make things too complicated, but you have to make basically two assertions for every assertion that you make inside the theory. You also have to make one assertion outside the theory in order to define the theory itself completely. If you don't, if you just have the one referent and you don't assert a reference frame, you leave it open, sure, and that's great, but then I can't follow you because I don't know what your reference frame is. I don't know how to interpret what you're saying in order to predict what you mean when you say something. So the only way that I know how to interpret what the author's intent is if the author provides me with their reference frame, either implicitly or explicitly. but I need that reference frame, because if I don't have the reference frame, then I can't measure the definitions. And if I can't measure the definitions, then I can't measure anything in the theory, because they all go back to definitions. Ultimately, every theory is composed upon a platform of definitions, and every argument inside of a theory is ultimately derived from an argument of definition. So it has to go back to definitions in order to have a functional theory, and those definitions have to be defined by a reference frame in order to have the definitions that they have. If we don't have the reference frame, then we don't have definitions. We just have a whole bunch of words floating in space, and no one knows what they mean. And we approach the theory then, admittedly openly, but from an arguably non-utilized, it can't be utilized in that state. It's sort of left latent, which could be respectful if you're, let's say, in disagreement with it, but it's not really useful if you're trying to build an agreement with it. If you want to agree with the theory, you're going to need to set up a reference frame that justifies it. If you are already in disagreement with a theory, then at the very least you can leave it open, but then you just don't judge it because it's open. So you don't know if in that openness there is some justification, you just haven't found it, versus closing it off and saying it's dismissed, it has no justification. Those are two completely different statements. So we just leave it open and we say there could be a justification, I just haven't found it. I'm not saying there isn't one, but I haven't found it. And so because of that, I don't integrate it into my belief system. But if it has no justification, then that's completely different. That's just, you just dismiss it. Then it's just an error. And if you do that, and there are some theories that look at other theories like that, where they're so completely contradictory to each other that they can't appreciate the other one as being valid. And that will invariably happen to at least one position inside of any given theory, that it will be considered to be invalid, and it will just be considered to be absolutely, useless or crazy, or has no value, or can't be explained, or is somehow outside of the theory, but yet we know that it exists in some way. Something like that will happen. The reference frame is supposed to clear that for you so that you don't have that happen, or at the very least that it gets reduced. If you leave it open, that kind of deals with it in the sense that it doesn't allow it to be judged to have been found to be invalid. But that doesn't mean that it is valid. It just means that it hasn't been measured to have been invalid yet. So it doesn't really fully complete it. You have to have the framework so that you can complete it. And like I said, if you make an assertion of anything, the framework of that is going to be composed of both having asserted nothing and everything, because nothing would then be one of the assertions made in the assertion of everything. So it also has the assertion of everything at its framework, so that asserting nothing and asserting anything are equivalent from the reference frame only, meaning that they both use the same reference frame. If you were to assert any single or finite group of fundamentals and say that these things exist necessarily, self-evidently, and have no creator and just are always present, such as space, time, mass, energy, God, whatever, you can make those where you count how many there are, and you say it's this many. You don't say, well, it all started from some, either an unknown number of something and blah, blah, blah. No, we're talking about specific assertions. So like, I assert that there is always space. I assert that there is always time, something like that. And you can have as large of a group as you want, but it has to be finite in order for this to apply. Because if it's infinite, then you have asserted everything. And the framework for that has to be the assertion of nothing. So that everything ends up being the opposite of nothing. And instead of nothing being the opposite of everything, for example. So depending on which one you assert, you have to use the other one to justify it, or you have to use the other one to define it, because it's the only other thing outside of it that you can use. So that's how you can build a theory from the origin, and that's basically the structure of the origin of any theory is that you assert one of those three things, and most of them assert anything. Most of them assert, a specific set of self-evident or given premises. And from those given premises, then it derives from then on everything else. But it doesn't ever tell you how it got those original premises. So that's asserting anything. The framework of that is to have asserted everything. So what it says is, the reason I'm able to assert this specific thing is because I'm pulling it from the set of all things. And I'm doing that because I'm asserting that there is a set of all things. And I'm asserting that there is a set of all things so that I can pull from that set of all things this one thing that I'm saying is so self-evident that you can't disprove that it ever didn't exist. And then from then on, I can derive everything else from that. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward process once you do that, because then you're just deriving. Now, let's say, for example, that we asserted something like just one specific thing that was neither nothing nor everything, but just a finite set of existential fundamentals. So let's say that we assert that there is space and time. And so then we say there has always been space and time, and we'll just assert both of those. So that's our set. It's a two-element set of space and time existing within a framework of everything. And it's saying that space and time exist within the context of or in relation to everything else. And from that, then we derive that everything has its own space and its own time line where it extends into space and extends into time. That there is not anything that does not have space, and then there is not anything that does not have a temporal duration, that nothing lasts for zero amount of time. Everything extends into time at least a little bit. And then I can say, well, because of that, then there must have been some origin time where space and time first originated, and then there has to be a space and a time where they will cease, where they'll terminate, because everything has to have a space, including the end of time. So that means there has to be a beginning and an end, even to space and time. And then when we say that, then we say everything, all that stuff, is somehow composed inside of space and time. That reference frame is actually inside of, not outside of, the assertion that there is such a thing as space and time, because we're saying that there is not anything that does not have space and time. So that reference frame of everything else that we can possibly think of, including nothing and being, or nothing and everything, have to have space and have to have time. And so then those get displaced from the group that we exist in, existence of finite things, exist in between the absolutes of nothing and being, or everything. And we then, as relativities, as finite structures, exist in between those two. And that's how that renders everything in existence that way. So you can then think of everything as being an extension of space and time, or an extension into space and time, such that the limit of God or the limit of the Creator would then have to necessarily be outside of space and time in order to have created the space and the time that everything uses in order to exist. So you can derive any theory like that from it. That was very sloppily done, but if I do this enough times, I'll be able to explain exactly how to build any theory. And the most basic is that we have to start with the origin and then show how to derive at least, I'd say, two steps out from that. So you've got three steps: origination, and then the first step beyond origination, and then the first step beyond that first step. And then once you have those three, that should be the bare minimum necessary to then derive anything else that you want from the theory, and you can see the structure of it. So when I get to that point, when I can fluidly and gracefully explain concisely how to originate, terminate, and bridge the origination termination of everything in a universe of discourse, then I think I'll be good. Oh, and by the way, that's then we have to draw the line there too, is like, how complex do we want to go? I guess, like I said, for 3 steps in, we're looking at 3 dimensions. So that would probably be enough, I think, like I said, to just replicate that after I give that information. So I'll be all right.